This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 443, violinist.io. This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. On today's show, we're talking about violinist.io, managing Composer Dependencies, and automation with guest Eirik Morland. We'll also cover Composer Patches as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Eirik Morland. Eirik is an open source enthusiast, longtime Drupal contributor, and community member. He founded violinist.io almost 7 years ago to scratch an itch. He's also a prize-winning beer brewer and lives in Norway with his wife and daughter. And fun fact, his partner turns 40 tomorrow. So happy birthday.
Yes, happy birthday.
So welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm Nick Lapham, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are Martin Anderson-Klutz, Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nick. Hello, internet friends.
Copying John's intro from years back. I don't know if that was intentional, but you are filling in for John today, so it's apropos. And also joining us for the third week is Anna Mikhailova, Director of Technology at Kalamuna.
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here for my third week.
Happy to have you. And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin, a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted a simple way to manage patches to Drupal core and your contrib projects? There's a Composer plugin for that. It's called Composer Patches, and it was created in April of 2015 by Cameron Wiggins. It is actively maintained. It has test coverage, and it actually has a documentation site as well as a markdown file in the repo to help you get started. There are only 10 open issues, 2 of which are bugs, which is pretty phenomenal considering it's been installed over 42 million times and it's approaching 43,000 installs per day, according to a recent blog post that we'll have linked in the show notes. Now, using the plugin is simple. You require cwiggins/composer-patches the same way you would a Drupal contrib project. The important difference is that Composer will ask you if you trust Composer Patches to make changes to your code base. Once you grant that, the plugin is ready to start applying patches. You can specify what patches you want applied by adding patches in a section in the extra section of your project's composer.json file or by adding a patches.json file. Each patch can be specified using a URL or a path relative to the JSON file. And in theory, it's possible to have Composer Patches pulled directly from the diff in a merge request on GitLab, but this is a significant security risk and should always be avoided. The first beta release for the 2.0 branch actually dropped support for dependency patch resolution, noting that it had become the source of most of these support requests that Cameron was dealing with. In the end, the community made it clear that they would resist upgrading without this capability, so the most recent Beta 2 release adds it back in. Finally, I should note that on his website, cwiggins.net, Cameron mentions that he's currently looking for full-time employment. So if your organization relies heavily on Composer in general, or Composer Patches specifically, consider reaching out to Cameron. So let's talk about Composer Patches.
I have so much to say about this. I love this project, unironically, but it's always funny because the first time I add a patch to a project, I always forget that I need to include this, and I'm always like, why didn't that work? And then I remember. But I want to point out a couple of things. One is it's not just for core or contrib projects on Drupal. You can also patch any vendor project. So for example, there's the Commerce UPS project right now by default does not work because one of the underlying library doesn't have PHP 8.2 support, I think, or maybe even 8.0 support. So you need to patch the underlying library that module is using, and so there's ways to do that. So if you need to patch anything that is pulled in with Composer, you can use this plugin, which is fantastic. Another quick thing, something that I've been doing for a lot of my clients that has made this a lot nicer for me to maintain is whenever I'm patching a project, first of all, I only use local patches unless I'm testing a patch for the first time. But before I commit something, I make sure that the first section of the patch has a quick description of what it's doing, then a link to the issue on Drupal.org that it's resolving. And then if it's a patch file, the way I normally do it is I include the issue number. I then um, include, if it's a merge request, which most patches are now, I include the uh, git hash for the commit that I've copied. Because that's the one thing that I kind of miss with merge requests. Is the nice thing about patches is you used to be able to like, oh, this is patch 12, comment 12. And if it stops applying or something, you can look at the issue, you can be like, oh, there's been 4 patches since. It's a lot harder to do with merge requests to know if something has changed in the interim. So I've been attaching the git hash, and then I can just look at the merge request and see how many commits there have been since, and if I need to change it. I think that's the one thing that needs to be resolved with merge request is a way to like say this is a point in time that everybody's tested it's working. There's been changes since then, or there haven't been changes. But that's the way I've been kind of keeping my sanity with Composer patches, having a link to the issue, having the git hash, and then I can kind of do investigation if I need to.
So I also have an observation around this package, which I also a huge fan of and use it a lot. But there's an observation when you work in a larger team, when people find out that they can actually use patches. This is convenient. They can, fix the code that weren't working. But this makes it sort of tempting to fix this problem they encountered without reporting the issue and submitting the patch or these days on Drupal.org merge request to usually the open source project. And I tend to be very strict with people when they include local patches, because then it will not be obvious, did they also create a merge request or not? And then it's very useful to have that, as you mentioned, Nick, a reference to the original issue, which makes it more obvious if people either, neglected or forgot to create the issue, because we are building on top of open source software and we're doing it together after all. So it's a variation of with great power comes great responsibility, I believe.
The only time I've created a patch that I haven't contributed back was actually a module where I had to apply 4 patches to get things working, 3 of which were issues that I had created and pushed up on Drupal.org. So I had contributed those back. But it was a weird situation where the current dev for that module was broken. And my patches, even though they were against dev, they conflicted with each other because they were fixing slightly different things. And so I ended up having to create like a combined patch just for that project. And it would have been useless for other people. So, I didn't want to kind of create a muddied up thing. So it was kind of like a weird, unique situation where I had multiple patches for a particular client, for a particular project that had been contributed, but they conflicted with each other. And I couldn't just use dev or specific version because they were all broken. So I had a kind of a unique situation. But I agree. If you're writing a patch for a project, you should contribute that back to Drupal.org. Well, thanks, Martin. So how can folks connect with you or suggest a module of the week?
Nick, we're always happy to get nominations for module of the week in the Talking Drupal channel in Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as Manclue in all of the Drupal or social platforms.
This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. Let's talk about life after Drupal 7 end of life. Since August 2023, there's been a lot of discussion around Drupal 7's official end of life in January of 2025. It's no secret that many companies, organizations, and individuals are still on Drupal 7 and have yet to migrate. I think we can all agree that migration, while beneficial, is not always feasible, and this is where Hero Devs comes in. Hero Devs has partnered with core team maintainers of Drupal 7 to build and maintain the Drupal 7 never-ending support product, ensuring the same quality of support you have come to expect over the years. Drupal 7 never-ending support, or NES, allows for an effortless transition, allowing your site to remain secure, compliant, and compatible after Drupal 7 goes end of life. This allows you to migrate in your own time or potentially not at all. Hero Devs promises to keep Drupal 7 alive and well, offering support for the current top 100 Drupal 7 modules. If If you'd like to know more about Drupal 7 never-ending support, visit herodevs.com. That's HERODEVS.com. So, Eirik, let's start with a simple question. What is violinist.io at a high level?
Well, at a high level, the one sentence would be it's a tool that runs Composer updates and creates pull requests. But to illustrate it at a high level, I like to think of it just as another person that works in your team or at your agency. Let's imagine this person is a robot and it's holding a violinist in its, a violin in its left hand. And then with its right hand, it's running Composer commands. So that's what violinist.io is. It's a robot holding a violin. But like more seriously, it's running Composer update commands, and then it tries to follow what seems to be a general best practice, or at least a very widely implemented development practice, where you submit pull requests for your changes to the code base, and this is usually done by a team member, and instead of a team member doing this for dependency updates, now a robot can do it.
So Eirik, is there anything else you can tell our listeners about how the tool works?
Well, it works nowadays. There are actually a number of very similar tools. People have probably also heard about Dependabot or Renovate. Those are tools that do this similar stuff. So how it will work for an end user is basically that you will see a pull request being created, usually with a diff then in the Composer lock file, or theoretically, I guess, in the Composer JSON file as well, if you're sort of broadening the version range somehow. It works like that by running the actual Composer commands, just like any human would do. So it's an automated process of the very boring and tedious work it is to write very similar commands after each other in the terminal. Yeah.
What kind of configuration or different usage options do customers have when they use the tool?
So there's many options, I guess, but the thing that people are most opinionated about, I think, is sort of how you would like to group the updates, or like what kind of packages you want to update. So, for example, some people like that from time to time there is a pull request that updates everything, and it will just be kept updated with, if there's a new version, then that's also included then in that pull request. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of this. I like one pull request per package, which will then sort of isolate things a bit. For example, if your tests break and so on. Then there are all of the ranges of options that would include, do you want to update with dependencies? Do you want to update only your direct dependencies? Do you want to update your dev dependencies? Do you want to update Drupal core together with Drupal core dev and Drupal core project message, for example? Do you want to update all of the Symfony packages together with each other and all of those kinds of things? So there's in the category of what should be included in a pull request, I guess that's the most opinionated part of it. And then there's also, of course, other configuration options like what version of PHP are you running? Nowadays, probably not so relevant, but also earlier, what version of Composer are you required to run for this project, and so on. So things you would expect in a tool that would be tasked to do a job of a person, only automated, basically.
Nice. Thank you. So you mentioned about Composer update and automation and writing commands. How does tool work under the hood? Like, are you running Composer, or like are you running some sort of like code generation mechanism like AI or something like that to come up with those commands and then create a PR out of it?
Yeah, it's unfortunately does sound kind of cool with AI and all of that, but it's as boring as it maybe it's Composer commands under the hood. So to sort of assemble the list of updates that is needed or wanted by the end user, Violinist uses the Composer command Composer outdated, which has a couple of options. For example, do you want to see only versions that are within the minor range? Do you want to see the direct dependencies and so on? But that's the actual command that is being run, which an end user could run as well. But in this case, a robot runs, and this determines then, after some sort of a filtering process or broadening the scope of the updates or whatever configuration options you have assembled, that's going to be the basis for what ends up being updated. So you can quite often compare actually what is displayed as part of the update log on Violinist with what you can type in a terminal yourself with the Composer outdated command.
So can you customize how certain projects are handled? And what I mean by that is something, for example, that I found in the most recent, I don't know, 6 months or so, whenever I update Drupal core, I have to remove Drush first, because for whatever reason, Drush has some sort of dependency somewhere that breaks. If I remove Drush, update core, and then add Drush back in, everything works fine. If I try to update core while Drush is installed, no matter what I do, it just won't work. Can you handle those types of situations with Violinist? Or have you found the magic way to update core without updating Drush at the same time?
I guess I could answer that question because I only update Drupal core with Violinist, and I never have this problem. So I could say that this solves all your problems. But it sounds like you've encountered a problem that probably Violinist would have encountered as well, seeing as it's just a robot running the same commands as you. But there are a couple of different ways you can customize it, although your specific scenario sounds a bit hard. A couple of solutions that people are using are utilizing either the scripts in Composer itself. You can add, for example, post-install commands or pre-update commands and all of these kinds of things. And the Violinist, since it's just using Composer after all, will respect this. Unless you specifically disable scripts, of course. So that's one option. The other option that some people are finding useful is that some people have different sort of Git hooks in their projects. For example, I have seen some people, for example, run integration tests before they're committing stuff. Which will be a problem, of course, for a robot that's simply running Composer commands and don't have an update, database or anything. Of course, This is relevant for Drupal and all other frameworks. And what they typically do then is to utilize the environment variables available in the environment where Violinist runs and sort of conditionally do different kinds of things based on the fact that Violinist is the environment, so to speak. So I'm assuming either one of these approaches or maybe even a combination could be relevant here. But personally, it sounds kind of like that project is a bit broken, though. So I don't know. But sounds like an interesting challenge. Try to add some Violinist to it and see if it helps.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to my next question. How much technical knowledge is required to set up Violinist? I mean, do you have to be a developer that's familiar with these tools, or is it something really simple to set up on an existing project?
I think that's a very interesting question, and not like a yes/no answer, or I guess it's not a yes/no question. I guess not an answer on a scale, because it kind of relates to how much technical knowledge do you need to run Composer. Like strictly speaking, you can open a terminal and do it. Is it a good idea? Probably not. Are people doing it? Yes, obviously they are. So I think it's entirely possible to add Violinist if you already are using Composer. And that's basically the answer to that. If you're not using Composer, then Violinist is totally useless. So that's the sort of extent of knowledge that there is needed. But of course, the actual benefit of it comes when you have some sort of process around your development workflow and your dependency updates and probably deployments and testing and all of these things as well. So if that was an answer.
Yeah. So it sounds like you need some terminal experience, you need some experience with Composer, but once you set that up, it kind of automates a lot of the stuff that you had to do before. And to be honest, I suspect the particular project I'm talking about, it's just that Drush and core just get out of sync. And if you're using Violinist, one of the benefits is it's easier to keep everything in sync, even on minor versions. And so it's probably just an issue that you didn't experience because every week you're just merging that pull request and things are updated. But
something like that. But of course, like technical experience and Composer is one thing, but the actual end result of running Violinist are pull requests. So, I mean, if you don't know what that means, or you don't utilize that, or you don't use Git or stuff like that, then that's another aspect of technical knowledge that would greatly benefit your project. Yeah.
Can Violinist send notifications that the pull request has been created, or like a Slack integration or email integration, something like that?
Well, not for the actual creation of the pull requests or stuff like that, because the different providers usually have great Slack integration, email notifications, and all of that. So there's no need to duplicate that. So that's where you get those notifications. But there are some notifications around when things don't go as planned. For example, you have configured Violinist to run on PHP 8.1, and then, someday the day will come where you upgrade the environment to 8.2, and who are you to remember that you also need to go into Violinist and update that by yourself? So stuff like that, for example, or you're trying to upgrade to a version of a package that now includes one of the patches that you have added with the package Martin mentioned earlier, which will totally fail a Composer upgrades. So those kinds of notifications are what the Violinist will send you.
Okay.
Can Violinist merge a PR into like some sort of a dev branch to completely automate the process so that a person doesn't need to go to like GitHub or Bitbucket, whatever, and check the PR, but like kind of trust and see all the updates on the dev environment, something like on a multi-dev, something like that?
Great question. Technically, yes and no, I want to say, because that's a requirement of Violinist is that you use one of these providers, for example, GitHub or GitLab or something like that, and it will always create the pull requests. But Violinist includes an option to enable the auto merge feature, which these platforms typically include. So personally, I have that on all of my projects, including Violinist IO, the website itself. It merges all of the pull requests automatically and deploys them to the dev environment. And that way, the result is the same, while technically it's not working like you described. But you don't need to be a human to intervene into getting these updates out there if you have these sort of underlying tools in place, I guess. Yeah.
Okay.
So Violinist work with any Composer project, not just Drupal sites, right?
That's correct. There is a range of PHP projects or types of projects on Violinist. I don't have the stats right in front of me, but I have a feeling there's more Drupal projects just because, I come from the Drupal world myself and talk with Drupal people and other people in Drupal agencies and stuff like that. But all of the PHP frameworks that are most common and known are represented there, like Magento, Symfony, WordPress, Craft CMS, Typo3, all of these things. So people use it for whatever they use Composer for. Yeah.
Are there any security risks that would be presented if people are using Violinist on their projects or for their work?
Well, I guess there's a pros and cons kind of a thing here. There's certainly a security risk to your work or project if you don't update your website. But naturally, to be able to do what it does, namely check out the code base and run some Composer commands, it's going to have to be able to access your code base, which in and of itself, of course, broadens the sort of attack surface or like access surface, if you will. But it runs in containers, which are ephemeral and destroyed and never seen again after it's been run. And it uses the OAuth token mechanisms of the different providers to get these things, so you can revoke the access fairly easily. But naturally, there's an increase in risk when you grant increased access to an increased number of actors, including a violinist. But yeah, I guess that's the answer to that question.
So for people thinking about using this now that they've heard about it, what are the costs of violinist.io if they're going to start using it?
Can I just answer super cheap and let's not talk about numbers? That's my personal opinion. It's very cheap compared to, having staff run these Composer commands. If you try to do the math of the hours billed or even the hours that you have to pay for people to actually do this and multiply it with number of projects and so on, it's going to be pretty easy to understand the value. But it's a tier-based pricing model. There's a free version where you get one project for free, one private project for free. Yep. And public projects, typically public websites, open source, hosted on GitHub, is unlimited amount of those on all of the plans. So for most of the agency types of businesses that use Violinist, they either use the so-called agency plan or the enterprise plan. So basically, it's a model where it costs $2 per project for the agency plan and $4 for the enterprise plan in tiers per month.
I will second your comment that it's super cheap. I mean, usually you see something like this, you're used to cost being like free $10 a month, $1,000 a month, right? And it's 10, 20, 40.
And then there's like more than 10 projects. Call us, schedule a sales call. So yeah.
I really like what you did on the pricing page too, where each tier has all of the features of every tier and just crosses out the ones that it doesn't have. It makes it so much easier to compare what you're getting with each upgrade.
Thank you. I appreciate that comment very much.
I feel like I've never seen that before, and it makes it so much easier to see what you're getting. I love it. It's awesome. I actually have a question. Pivoting away from price for a second, I have a question from one of the patrons. Thanks, Peter. He wanted to know how Violinist compares with Dependabot, because I know we use Dependabot on a lot of our projects. Does it just work better with Composer? Like, what's the comparison between Dependabot and Violinist?
So by far, there's two areas that are huge differences. First of all, Dependabot works exclusively with GitHub. So if you host your code in Bitbucket, you can't use Dependabot because it's owned by GitHub, after all. So that's a huge, if you don't use GitHub, you can't use Dependabot. So that's like very easy comparison. The other one is Dependabot is a general update tool that updates all kinds of dependencies in all kinds of package managers. including Docker, Maven, Nugget, what have you. Violinist updates only PHP Composer packages and only that. So if you have a requirement to also update the Docker files in your project, or more frequently requested NPM packages, then that's not going to be possible with the Violinist. You can combine them, of course, only update NPM with Dependabot, but Violinist only and exclusively only works with PHP Composer updates. And I think as an extension to that answer, I will also say that by having this focus, it's also much better, of course, in my super objective opinion. And I'm saying that because it's an observation that some of these other competing tools are are ignoring the environment part a bit. So, for example, you could get an update that would update one of your packages to a newer version that for some reason also requires a newer version of PHP, which probably, hopefully, your automated tests will uncover, but it's still very annoying that it was attempted to be upgraded because it's not useful when you're running an older version of PHP, for example. So it's much more focused, much more, should I say, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, reliable and accurate was the word I was looking for. And the other thing I want to mention here is very relevant to Drupal, actually. All of these other competing tools have their own way of indicating, or you can even specify as part of the configuration, only update automatically security updates. Security updates for Drupal and specifically Drupal contrib are not part of the Drupal, no, I mean the PHP Security Advisories database. So there is no way, these other tools are usually using that sort of canonical source for CVE's security advisories, and it will not detect if there's a new version of Coffee, for example. Quite recently, there's a security update of the Coffee module. There is no indication with these other tools that this update is in fact a security update. This also lately includes Drupal core, which also needs to have this information in this manually updated security advisories database. So for many people, this is an important factor, and it differs in this area.
Okay.
So you already touched on some of the differences in the plans, I think particularly around the number of sites that can be used. Are there any other sort of easy to understand ways you might talk about the differences in the capabilities of the different plans?
Yeah. So I would say the most common feature that people need and makes them required upgrade, so to speak. A plan is if they're using self-hosted GitLab, for example. This is only supported on the enterprise plan. I don't actually remember in my head what's the difference of these plans, so I have to double check here.
It looks like to me, looking at the comparison, a lot of it is logging, customizable messaging and labels, and code review assignments.
Right. Yes. So there's some there's typically some of these things that you typically use when you are part of a team, I would say, not a one-person show, or somehow need to be able to, go back and look at these logs, or you need to you have some internal processes around what should you do with this pull request, for example. Stuff like that, and code reviews, as you mentioned. So I guess that's reflected in the names of the teams, that they sort of, it's the agency part where you're typically several people, and
So who would be the ideal user of Violinist?
My personal opinion on this is that you get the most out of Violinist if you have if you're doing development in some sort of professional capacity, should I say. And with this, I mean, if you are using some of these other practices that are quite common, like continuous integration and continuous deployment. To me, at least, it makes the most sense to update dependencies after you are actually comfortable that they don't break the site, which is something you try to ensure with automated testing. And of course, this security aspect and this automation aspect it's quite natural to also extend that with some sort of automated deployments. Some people somehow, instead of having automated tests, maybe they combine it with some sort of preview environment where they can manually go in and check what this pull request does and verify that the code doesn't break. But to the question, the ideal user, I would say a user or an agency or an organization where you also use these other tools and paradigms of continuous integration and continuous deployment.
So you mentioned that users can use this on a self-hosted GitLab instance, and that it's running everything in a Docker container. Can a security conscious client run these locally or on their own self-hosted environment entirely, even if it's not GitLab?
I should just point out that this is the self-hosted GitLab part here is that the code is hosted there, but the containers that run the updates still runs in the violinist infrastructure. So that's sort of the security conscious organization uses self-hosted GitLab for code hosting. But I guess these same security conscious organizations would want to do, as you say now, run the violinist script, if we want to call it that, on their own infrastructure. And it's a great question. Theoretically, the answer is yes. Well, quite obviously, because it's nothing unique with the infrastructure, but also because most of the pieces that are sort of assembled together to run these things are open source. So it's possible to sort of figure this out yourself and somehow cobble it together, should I say. But it's not sort of a supported model in that sense that it's actually something you can purchase a license for running this on your own infrastructure or something like that, or even supported. And I think the reason for that is that like it quite often is with people running businesses, I guess, is basically the demand for it. There was one person one time who asked about the theoretical possibility of it, and then it turned out it was not an option anyway. But I think given a certain demand, then that is sort of a license where you could get support for running it self-hosted would be an option for the security conscious organization that would come with this suggestion, but it's not documented anywhere how you do it, and it's not officially supported, but it's possible. It's theoretically possible. But I should also mention that like any other software as a service tool, the thing you pay for with the software as a service is, of course, not having to manage the infrastructure. And one part of this is what I want to call the schedule or the interval for these updates, because if you want to self-host it yourself, what are you going to do then? Probably going to run it once a day on a cron job or something like this. But with Violinist taking all of this sort of complicated part, its complexity around trying to figure out when it's time to run an update, then I can say that the interval between the update being available and the pull request being available is surely going to be very much better. So that's sort of what you're paying for with the software as a service part here.
Yeah. And I want to point out before we move on too that I might have painted us into this corner by asking the question the way I did with security conscious. I think security conscious organizations are using something like Violinist, right? As we mentioned kind of at a high level, like the benefit of getting your keeping your code up to date based on dependencies is much higher than just keeping everything, sequestered, right? If you can shorten the time and effort it takes to get a security update live, that's better for the organization, for the end users, right? But there are some situations where the code cannot leave a particular network or something, and those are the types of organizations we were asking this question about. But we were saying a security conscious organization would want that. A security conscious organization wants to keep their dependencies up to date, and that's the most important thing, especially if it's a public thing like Drupal, right? It's not, that code is already out there, and if somebody finds out that you're using it, you just want to make sure it's up to date. So
yeah, and I should mention it's also an observation that some security conscious organizations are in fact not considering violinist for this very reason, because they would have a requirement from their IT department or something that we need to vet this tool. They need to be an approved vendor, and the infrastructure needs to be here or there or not there and stuff like that. So there's been several examples of where that's been ruled out, and where I guess your suggestion here would have been helpful for them to be able to run violinist for sure. Yeah.
So many of our listeners will know that Drupal 11 is expected later this year. How can a tool like Violinist help sites to prepare for that kind of major upgrade?
So I guess technically Violinist will not upgrade your site to Drupal 11, because it will simply refuse to upgrade major versions. That's a restriction, basically. So what it will do then would be to help you prepare, as you said in your question. So I think the key aspect here is I think it has to be something that you have experienced for you to understand what it means. But if you ever tried to upgrade a site from 8 to 9 or 9 to 10, where the code base hasn't been touched for 2.5 years, something like that, then there's not going to be that one simple composer command and you're magically on the next Drupal version, because there's going to be so many upgrade hooks, there are going to be so many incompatibilities. And so it's more of a sort of an organizational mindset it will help you with, that you try to keep up with the pace. You don't do everything in one go every other year. You do it all of the time instead. So it's more nudging you towards doing the right thing in the weeks and I guess years before the Drupal 11 upgrade. So I think the value of that is not something you can see unless you have experienced the opposite yourself. It's very painful.
Yeah, I mean, I think one area that it really helps is it keeps everything up to date. The people that wait, like I get contacted by organizations whenever a major version comes out, and they'll say, hey, a new version's out, we'd like to update. And they've kept security updates up to date, but there's some modules that have updates over the years that just don't have a security update. They don't have a security issue. So they might be on admin toolbar, a whole major version behind an admin toolbar. And now you have to now admin toolbar almost never breaks things, but now you have to update admin toolbar instead. But if you have Violinist keeping everything up to date, well, the only thing you're looking at are the ones that need to be updated for the major version, which means that there's less surface to look at, and it makes it much cleaner. So I think it's a huge help just from that perspective.
Yeah, and also like you say, when there's just a bunch of things, it's going to end up in a similar situation as I described earlier, where you have one pull request with all of the updates. And what is the single thing that is breaking it right now? Because, at this point, I'm removing the vendor folder, I'm deleting the log file, I'm just trying everything. And then something broke, and it's like, what module was that? And I mean, it's going to help you with that.
Yeah, and it helps with the incremental fixes. Like if a module breaks in June, but you don't update that module until December, along with 10 other things, it becomes, like you said, it becomes a lot harder to find what that cause was. But if you're upgrading things incrementally as they change, you're more likely to find that issue and fix it before you have to update it because there's a major version coming out. So,
do you know of any complementary tools web teams can use to make sure they're following best practices?
Yeah, so I guess the term tools is something you can interpret as you will, but as I said, using integration testing or continuous integration and continuous deployment alongside automated dependency updates is going to make everything, they are very complementary, I would say. So if there are tools or not, I'm not sure, but that's a very big recommendation for me. But there's also other tools that I guess are somewhat platform specific, but I can speak to the platform GitHub, for example, where you can have different sort of tools that will sort of analyze the pull request in terms of what are the dependencies that are updated here, what are their scores in different aspects, those kinds of things. And there's this is also part of Violinist, I guess, to some extent, but there's tools for different platforms. And then there's one area that I think probably the single most asked questions for people that are updating Drupal with tools like Violinist. What do you do with database updates? Because that's not going to be possible within Violinist, of course. And then you can use tools to sort of visualize if this update includes a database update, for example, and this can help you, determine the risk of merging it or even automatically failing the tests because database updates would require some sort of manual intervention. And this tool specifically that I usually use is a Drush command called site schema, Drush site schema, that I am the author of. So recommendation of my other tool there, but I find that's very useful for sort of determining the risk of merging a pull request.
So I noticed on your website that you have a list of some notable users, including Lullabot, Aqua, Chromatic, and Kalamuna. Can you share, or maybe I should ask Anna this and Martin this because they're the clients. Maybe we can share how Violinist is being used by these organizations.
I mean, I could answer in a general way because they use it in different ways. Actually, there are different types of agencies, Lullabot and Chromatic and Kalamuna, I believe, as well. Mainly have used it for their client projects. I'm actually a bit unsure if Kalamuna quite recently ended their subscription, but
we still use it on one of the clients, but we had some challenges, which I think it might be because of configuration options that you mentioned, but developers found it was faster for them to run updates locally and push than have Violinist PR. That was one of the reasons why I actually asked if it could auto merge, because we set up it to have one PR per dependency, and it was overwhelming on a lot of projects because a lot of PRs, a lot of notifications, and people felt like it is easier to do it on their locals to resolve conflicts and see everything being actually not broken before they apply, because our PR policy is to pull it to your local for the reviewer, to pull it to your local and check it. So they're like, why am I checking a PR that I can make myself by running Composer update on that particular project? So with having an ability to auto merge, which I think was potentially an option I either missed or wasn't at the time when they originally set up, would definitely help, because we have CI tools, as you mentioned, that actually help us to do automated testing after that, and auto deploys and the visual regressions and all of that stuff. So now we could probably give it another try, but we do still use it on one of our enterprise clients.
Yeah. To extend on my general answer, I can say that some of them are using them for client projects, and Acquia, I believe, it is only. I'm not sure if they're still using it, but they used it for one of their open source projects, like a starter project or something like that. I checked actually before this episode. ViolinistBot is one of the top 3 contributors to that project, so it has at least been used, that's for sure. And also a very common place to start using Violinist that I see is that agencies like the one we just mentioned, but also organizations that use Violinist use it for their own internal tools or websites or for their blog or stuff like that. That's quite often the place where people start to evaluate if it will be helpful for them, I guess because of reduced risk on inferring that on their client or something like that. So the general answer to that question is in those 3 categories: open source projects, client projects, and internal projects.
So Eirik, what originally inspired you to create Violinist?
It was because at that time I had been using a similar tool for NPM, and I just noted that there was no tool like this for Composer and PHP. And this was at the time when you could start using Composer finally with Drupal, and I just found it boring to be doing this all of the time when it's just possible to do it automatically. So I sort of needed it and built it and found it useful, and wanted to see if that was something people found useful in such a way that they would pay for it even.
I've noticed that your public website, violinist.io, is actually Drupal 10. What is it like for you using Drupal as a SaaS type of the website?
So I think it's interesting because you don't quite often see that, and I think this is sort of a variation of 2 things. First of all, I work professionally with Drupal myself, so naturally this would be the tool that I reached to when I wanted to build a website that had users and authentication and some sort of integration and stuff like that. But it's also an observation that's somehow it sort of ends up when you're trying to build a fancy SaaS type of a solution. You're trying to build it on top of some exciting new technology that you want to try out or even build from scratch yourself, which makes Drupal sort of a boring choice because you already have the permissions, you have the user authentication, you have thousands of modules, you have all of these things in place that, of course, you could build from scratch instead, which of course, looking at it from a business perspective makes no sense at all, but it's exciting to build things from scratch, I guess. So I think Drupal has a reputation of being old and boring, and therefore it's not often being used. But I think it's a bit overlooked personally because you have so much things for free there. You have all of the authentication parts, you have the roles, which you can use to build these tiers, for example. You go from a premium tier to a agency tier, for example. It could just be different roles, and you have access to different things. It's like you get so much for free. So I think it has that reputation is a bit undeserved. But for me, it was natural to use it because I know it very well, and also wanted to sort of contribute something back from building it. So there's a lot of the parts there that are PHP packages and modules on Drupal.org and stuff like that. So that's somewhat of an inspiration to use Drupal as well.
But before I ask my next question, does violinist.io use Violinist to keep itself up to date?
Oh yeah, for sure. I checked, I didn't check recently, but there was at some point last year, I checked how many of the commits were made by the Violinist bot, and it was over 30%. So Violinist, the website, uses Violinist all of the time, and it's also auto-deployed every Thursday. So when security releases come out, they are on violinist.io in production the next morning. Well, morning for me is earlier than you, so hours after the security windows on Wednesdays. So usually when I wake up on Thursdays, it's on its way out, and I did not even open the terminal. So it uses it extensively, I will say. Yeah.
So Violinist itself, is it open source?
Well, a lot of the packages used under the hood is open source. So one notable example you will probably notice if you try to use it is that the first pull request that is opened will say something like this message posted by ViolinistBot is itself open source, and you can click a link and then you can sort of suggest a change to how to improve that pull request message. So that's like a package in itself. Violinist messages is the name of that package. But sort of assembling it all together is not, something you can just read about with reference to the self-hosting violinist. And the website itself is not open source either, including there's some custom modules there, and there's a theme. So it's not entirely open source for sure.
Okay, and what are, I mean, you're going to be preaching to the choir here, but what are some of the pros and cons of using so much open source software and having it available directly online?
Well, using the software, open source software, is quite obviously quite a lot of pros with doing that, because they're available and people are vetting it and finding security issues with it and so on. But I think the marketing effort of trying to be an open source type of a software company is also something that has its value. Like you can see on the organization page of Violinist on Drupal.org, for example, that there was so and so many Drupal core issues credited to this organization. Or you can see that this module that I'm about to download was sponsored or is maintained by Violinists, and then maybe that's your way in to read about Violinist for the first time. So stuff like this, I think that's sort of the main reason, or I guess main benefit of having the code that you use online. But I also find like it's an interesting aspect of being developer focused, so to speak, that you sort of support and you're rooting for open source makes developers usually try it. Maybe they're trying it for their own blog, maybe they're trying it for their own open source project, which is unlimited public projects are available to you on Violinist. And I think this is an interesting way into organizations, because it's the developers that are tasked with doing these composer updates, and they are probably not tasked with the procurement of different software in the company, but they are going to be sort of the grassroots movement towards saying, I have this tool, I tried it on my blog, I tried this for my open source project. They use Drupal, they are supporting open source software, and this is sort of becomes the way into I guess the procurement processes, if you will. So it's a marketing aspect there as well, I would say. But I should also note that it's not a gimmick either, though it sounds like the open source just for marketing. I'm actually also an enthusiast in this area myself, so it has actual value, but I'm observing it additionally has marketing value, which is convenient.
So it's great that you're doing much to support open source. Are there things that the community can do to help Violinist?
Well, I think this is an area where Violinists could improve for sure. It's not obvious how you can contribute, and there's a lot of parts that are open source and people could help, but it's not easy to sort of navigate your way in and finding the way to contribute. So I think it's an area with certainly a room for improvement. but the community can help support violinists by utilizing it, of course. I am very happy to support, as I said, open source projects, but also like community projects where just to take an example, if there's a private repository for Drupal Camp Florida or whatever, and they want to use violinists for that, obviously that's something violinist supports, and in that same category, community projects that just by coincidence is not open source software is something that the community can it helps violinists by being used, basically.
Makes sense.
So what is on the roadmap? Any exciting new features, changes that we should be looking for?
Yes, so there's one feature that has been too long on the roadmap, and it turned out to be quite the effort. It's the support for teams on violinists or organizations, if you will. So you can have sort of an organization for your agency, and then everyone can log in with their own GitHub user. Now there's this sort of a limitation that people usually log in with their system user or boot user on GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever you use, and then everyone shares this login. And it has been quite an effort to convert individuals into teams. I can just put it that way. And that's on the roadmap, and it's looking to be possible in not too distant future. And I hope this can, hopefully be interesting. I'm assuming, at least to a lot of the agencies that typically have some sort of enterprise clients where they have technical expertise on the client side, where they want to go in and see what are my updates looking like now. And I'm imagining it would be easy for then agencies to sort of bill their violinist bill to their clients more easily, and by having some sort of SLA budget and saving those hours of running those composer commands and billing them to the client with the same amount of money every month, it's going to be helpful to some clients, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I'm certainly, I have a couple projects in mind where I think this would be immediately useful. So, well, Eirik, thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure chatting about violinist and learning about how it can be used to keep your site up to date and more secure.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. Great talking to all of you.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest host, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. All right, Eirik, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, had any questions, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, you can find some contact information on violinist.io, of course. I also have a profile on Drupal.org, where people that are listening to this show also coincidentally hang out, I guess. And it's Eirik SM, Eiriksm, if you want to say it real quick. And then I'm also Urj on Twitter, ORKJ.
And
J.
Anna,
J is that.
and Anna, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, probably the best way is through Drupal or contact form or Drupal Slack. I'm A. Mikhailova, which is my first initial and my last name in Drupal Slack. And you can also find me through the kalamuna.com website.
And Martin, how about you?
Listeners can find me just about everywhere as @manclue.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
See you guys next week.